Lord Stellan Vaux had been back in Ottawa for 11 days when the name he had been successfully avoiding for the better part of a year found him at last, in the Governor-General's own drawing room, spoken by a man whose good opinion he had spent 3 careful years cultivating. It was the height of the parliamentary season, and Rideau Hall was full of exactly the people Vaux had built his life around impressing. He was good at this. He moved through a glittering room, the way a diplomat moves, through a difficult treaty. Attentive to everything, committed to nothing, leaving behind him the pleasant impression of a man who had just said something clever without anyone quite remembering what it was. He had paused beside Sir Edmund Wharton, a man of science who sat on 3 advisory boards and had the Governor-General's ear on matters of natural history, because Wharton had said something about a publication that caught the edge of Vaux's attention the way a thread catches on a nail, small and then not. "You haven't seen the Colville plates?" Wharton was saying to the man beside him with the faint incredulity of the genuinely enthusiastic. "Good Lord, man, where have you been? The collector's edition sold out in a fortnight. Every drawing room worth entering in this city has at least one framed on the wall, and the field guides themselves. I had one pressed into my hands by a geological survey man last month, who said his wife had been using them since spring. She identified 3 previously unrecorded variants of trillium in their back 40. 3, from illustrations in a shilling guide." "A shilling," said the other man. "The Homesteader's edition. She prints 2, one for the parlour, one for the field. The parlour edition is priced at what it's worth, which is considerable. The field edition is priced at what a settler woman can afford, which is next to nothing, and the difference in profit between the 2 pays for the difference in price. An arrangement," Wharton said, with a satisfaction that had the quality of personal pride in someone else's genius, "that I have described to 6 men in 6 months, and none of them has managed to find a flaw in." Vaux had gone very still. "Colville," he said, and something in his own voice alarmed him slightly. "Miss Brenna Colville from Quebec." "The very one. You know her work, then?" "I know," said Lord Stellan Vaux, in a voice that had gone rather carefully level, "the name." What he knew, which he did not say to Sir Edmund Wharton, was rather more than that. Miss Brenna Colville of the Laurentian Hills was his own promised wife, whom he had settled at his family's country estate 14 months ago, with a comfortable allowance, a hired companion, and a letter he would think about, that letter for the rest of the evening, and most of the night that followed, with a particular quality of regret that only one's own words, reread in their true light, can produce. But I am going to pause us here, right here in the Governor-General's drawing room, with Wharton still talking, and Vaux no longer hearing him, because before I tell you what was in that letter, and what Miss Colville did with the 14 months and the country house and the allowance he had meant as a comfortable exile, and what it cost him to deserve a place in a life that had grown so astonishing in his absence, you and I have our arrangement to attend to. Find the subscribe button for Moonlight at Bellwood and press it. It costs nothing, it takes a moment, and it means the next story reaches you the instant that I have it ready. There is always a next, and they are always worth the having. If you will not subscribe just yet, then you owe me one, and I am an extremely patient creditor, and I never misplace a debt. This is a story about the difference between a polished surface and a true one, and about a man who had to lose a great deal of shine before he understood the distinction. Come back with me now to the beginning of it. The match between Lord Stellan Vaux and the late Mr. Theodore Colville had been made the way such matches were still sometimes made in 1886, over a shared bottle and a shared history, by 2 men who trusted each other more than they trusted the fashionable world's opinion of their respective families. Theodore Colville had been the finest field naturalist in Lower Canada, a man of extraordinary mind and remarkably little money, whose small land grant in the Laurentians sat on the western edge of the Vaux family's much larger holdings. They had been friends since boyhood, and when Colville's debts mounted in his last years, the debts of a man who bought books before bread, and considered it a reasonable priority. Vaux's father had settled the whole of it in the old way, land and promise bound together, the Colville daughter to marry the Vaux heir when both were of age. Theodore Colville had died when Brenna was 24, leaving her the land, the arrangement, and his entire library, which she valued in precisely that order. Lord Stellan Vaux had inherited the promise along with the title at 28, and was now 33. And I will tell you honestly what he was, because the whole story turns on it, and because he is not, though the temptation to call him one is real, a villain. He was a man who had learned very early that the world he moved in had opinions, about land, about bloodlines, about carriages, and above all about wives. He had been raised by a father who was formidable and remote, and a mother who understood Ottawa society the way a general understands terrain, as something to be navigated, never crossed against. And he had grown in the way of men shaped by such parents into a creature of surfaces. His manners were impeccable, his club memberships were ideal, his opinions were always perfectly calibrated to the room he was in. And underneath all of it he had never once, in 33 years, asked himself whether he actually believed any of it, because the question had never cost him anything. And then it cost him everything. He had travelled to the Laurentians the spring before last to meet Brenna Colville properly, as adults, as the principals of an arrangement that had existed for years on paper. What he found was a woman of 26, who lived in a house full of plant presses and field notebooks, who had her father's grey eyes, and her father's habit with the precise, patient attention of someone who intends to understand rather than merely to see. She was not beautiful. The drawing rooms of Ottawa had a word for what she was, and the word was sensible, which is what drawing rooms say when they mean plain. She dressed practically. Her hands showed her work. She spoke in complete sentences, each one meaning something, and she did not perform. When Vaux said something charming, as he frequently did, she received it without the usual reflexive delight, and this disconcerted him in ways he could not afterwards have explained clearly. What she had, and what a less frightened man would have seen immediately, was something the French call presence and the rest of us fail to name. She was entirely herself, in a way that required no audience, and drew no attention to the requiring. She moved through her father's house like a person who belonged there, which sounds like a small thing, and is, in fact, a very large one. Vaux stayed 4 days. He was charming and careful, and kept his distance with the particular skill of a man who has made distance into an art form. And there had been one afternoon, the 3rd day, when it rained so heavily that they were confined indoors, and he had found himself beside her, at her work table, looking at a drawing she was making. A spray of wild columbine, rendered in pencil with a precision that stopped something in his chest, and she had talked for an hour about her father's work and what she intended to do with it, in a voice he had not heard from her before. Lower, unperformed, real. He had looked at the drawing and at the woman drawing it, and something in him had said very quietly, "Pay attention." He had not paid attention. He had gone back to Ottawa and listened instead to the voice of Lady Frederica Thorngate. Lady Frederica was the acknowledged wit of Ottawa's parliamentary set, a woman whose tongue was surgical and whose social memory was perfect. She had said to him at a dinner 3 weeks after his return, while the dessert was being cleared, "I hear you've been to see the naturalist's daughter Vaux. How tremendously worthy of you. Will she be pressing flowers at Rideau Hall, or shall she bring her specimen jars? I'm told she once spent an entire winter cataloguing mosses." Mosses. Imagine the dinner conversation. The table had laughed. It was the easy, light laughter of people who have never once been its object, and Vaux had made himself smile, and said nothing, and quietly resolved that Lady Frederica Thorngate would never be given Brenna Colville to practice her kindness upon. He told himself, for the next 6 months, that the resolution was protective. It took him the whole of this story to understand that hiding a woman from cruelty you haven't the backbone to answer is not protection. It is agreement wearing a gentler face. He wrote the letter in March, and he worked on it longer than he had worked on anything in recent memory, because he wanted it to be kind. He was very good at being kind. He was, in fact, so skilled at it that the kindness could carry almost any cargo without straining, and the unmistakable air of a woman. He wrote that he had returned from the Laurentians with the warmest impressions of their acquaintance. He wrote that he thought of their arrangement with the sincerest respect for their father's wisdom, and then, in sentences he polished the way, he polished everything, until the surface was smooth enough to hide what lay under it. He wrote that he had been reflecting on the demands that Ottawa society placed on those who wished to move freely within it, that these demands were considerable and would be unfair. Unfair was his word, to impose without preparation, and that he therefore proposed that she remove to Bellwood, the Vaux family's estate in the Gatineau hills, where every comfort would be arranged, an allowance settled, and a companion provided, a Mrs. Opal Firth, of wide social experience, who would be an excellent guide during this period, so that Miss Colville might have the time, and here is the sentence, the one she would carry for the rest of her life, so that she might have time to acquire the ease and confidence in society that will be expected of the future Lady Vaux, and which I have every expectation she will attain. The wedding to follow when both parties feel themselves quite ready. Read it quickly, and it is generous. Read it as Brenna read it, twice, slowly, with her father's eye for what a thing actually does rather than what it says it does, and it says something else entirely. It says, "You are not ready for my world. I am embarrassed by you. I am sending you to a comfortable distance until someone has sanded you into a shape that will not shame me, and I have hired the someone, and I have had the decency to call it a gift." She did not weep. Her cousin, who was with her when the letter arrived, reported afterwards that Brenna read it, folded it with care, sat in silence for nearly 2 minutes, and then said something the cousin did not fully understand until a year later. What she said was, "He has sent me to be finished, like a piece of furniture." And then she set the letter down, and picked up her pencil, and went back to the drawing she had been making when the post arrived. Her cousin asked carefully whether she intended to accept. "Of course," said Miss Brenna Colville without looking up. "He has given me a country house, an allowance, and instructions to improve myself. I intend to follow those instructions very thoroughly." Because here is the thing Lord Stellan Vaux did not know about the woman he had sent into comfortable exile. He had sent to a house in the Gatineau hills with unlimited time and a generous allowance and explicit instructions to think about acquiring polish, the most gifted botanical illustrator in Canada, and he had told her that her occupation, for the foreseeable future, was to concern herself with the business of becoming a lady. She arrived at Bellwood in the late spring and found it exactly as promised, large, quiet, comfortable, and entirely empty of purpose. She found also Mrs. Opal Firth. Now I want to give you Mrs. Firth properly, because she becomes, as the best minor characters do, the turning point the whole story pivots on. Opal Firth was a widow of 52 who had spent 25 years as secretary and then chief archivist of the Ottawa Natural History Society before her husband's death and her subsequent retirement. She was a woman who had organized 3 major expeditions, catalogued 40 years of specimen correspondence, and quietly written more than half of several papers published entirely under her male colleagues' names. She had taken Lord Vaux's commission, "Come and improve my fiancée's social confidence," partly for the income, and partly out of the curiosity of a woman who had spent a quarter-century watching other women's work disappear into institutions that thanked them by not naming them. She arrived at Bellwood expecting to find a sulky young woman in need of elocution. What she found on her second evening was her charge sitting at a table she had dragged to the window for the light, surrounded by specimen presses and her father's field notebooks, working on an illustration of Trillium grandiflorum, with the focused stillness of someone who has found the only place they make complete sense. "Miss Colville," said Mrs. Firth, with the caution of a woman approaching a very still pond. "What are you doing?" "Finishing what my father started," said Brenna without looking up, "and doing it differently. He drew for scientists. I want to draw for everyone." Mrs. Firth came closer and looked at the illustration. It was extraordinary, the kind of precise, living accuracy that makes a drawing breathe. And there was something in the composition, its decision about line and light, that made it simultaneously scientific and beautiful. "What do you mean?" said Mrs. Firth carefully. "Be everyone." And Brenna Colville looked up for the first time and told her. Every settler family moving into the Quebec interior needed to know their land. What was safe, what was medicinal, what was edible, what was not. Every woman managing a homestead without a doctor within 2 days' ride needed plant knowledge that nobody had yet put into a form she could carry in her pocket and read without a university education. Every community, French and English and Anishinaabe and Algonquin, was working from fragments, from what grandmothers remembered, from what the Geological Survey occasionally published in Latin for each other's benefit. "Somebody," said Brenna, with the quietness of someone who has been thinking about this for years and has finally been given the time to say it plainly, "needs to make the proper guide, with illustrations accurate enough to use in the field, in plain English and plain French, sized to fit a coat pocket, priced so that a homesteader's wife can buy it." Mrs. Firth, who had spent 25 years watching the institutions of science, failed to ask the question Brenna had just answered, sat down in the nearest chair. "And the natural history establishment?" she asked. "The journals, the societies?" "Will not do it," said Brenna. "Because there is no prestige in dressing a homesteader's wife. The women who could make such a thing are all employed impressing each other." She picked up her pencil again. "Lord Vaux has given me a large house, a quiet studio, and instructions to apply myself to becoming a lady. I intend to apply myself very thoroughly. Will you help me?" Mrs. Opal Firth, who had spent 25 years contributing to a world that did not credit her, said yes before she had quite finished, deciding to say it. It began with a woman named Marguerite, a French-Canadian homesteader, whose land abutted the Bellwood property, who arrived at the estate in June with a child she believed had eaten something harmful and nothing more useful than a description of the plant. Brenna identified it from the description alone. False hellebore, unpleasant but not deadly, and showed the woman the illustration she had drawn of it the week before. Marguerite looked at it for a long time, then she said, in careful English, "You drew this, from our hill." "From the North Field," said Brenna. "My mother would have known this plant, my grandmother. It is written in the books of the scientists, but they do not look like this. They look like," she gestured, "a motion, meaning dead things. This looks like the plant." Brenna took the drawing back and looked at it, as though seeing it fresh. Then she made 6 more. One for each plant the woman said her children regularly encountered, and wrote the names in English and French, and the properties in the plain language her father had taught her was the mark of real knowledge. That you understand a thing when you can explain it to anyone. By the end of summer she had done it for 3 other families. By autumn Mrs. Firth, who understood, from 25 years of institutional work, the difference between having a thing and putting it into the world, had organized the drawings into the first collection and found a printer in Ottawa. The name on every guide at Mrs. Firth's absolute insistence, illustrated by Miss Brenna Colville, Bellwood, Gatineau. "You will not hide," said Mrs. Firth, who had spent 25 years watching women's work vanish into other people's signatures. "Not while I manage the correspondence. I will not lengthen the middle of this story more than it needs. You can feel its shape already." The guide spread the way genuinely useful things spread, not with fanfare but with gratitude, from hand to hand, from farmhouse to farmhouse, from apothecary shelf to church lending library. A doctor in Renfrew wrote to ask whether there were more. A women's institute in Perth adopted them wholesale. The collector's edition, identical illustrations, better paper, larger format, framed beautifully, was Mrs. Firth's idea, and the price it commanded from Ottawa drawing rooms paid for 6 months of homesteader editions at the price of a good loaf. The name Colville reached the natural history journals, which printed appreciations that studiously avoided specifying the author's sex. The Geological Survey acquired a complete set. And the great Ottawa ladies, who did make the journey to Bellwood, came back changed, and not only in their understanding of Canadian plants. One such hour is worth giving you, so you understand what it was. The visitors came back changed by. Lady Constance Albright made the journey in the second autumn. She was a woman of 50 who had been a force in Ottawa philanthropy for 20 years, and who arrived at Bellwood with the slight wariness of a person accustomed to being the most formidable presence in any room. She stood in the still, north-lit studio, while Brenna looked carefully at the commission she had brought. A botanical illustration, already framed, purchased at considerable expense, intended as a gift. "You have had this framed," said Brenna. "Yes, it is quite lovely." "It is framed wrong." She said it without apology, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating the position of a door. "The framer has centered it on the largest flower." The drawing is not about the largest flower. It is about the relationship between all three. He has cropped the lower stem, and with it the entire meaning of the composition. The recipient will love the colors. She will not know why the picture never quite satisfies her. Lady Albright was silent. "I can give you the name of the framer who will do it correctly," Brenna continued. "He is in the Byward market, and he is not fashionable, and he will take direction without requiring you to understand the theory first." She handed the picture back. "The person receiving this gift will thank the drawing for the rest of her life, if you trust me on the frame." Lady Constance Albright, who had not taken direction from anyone in 11 years, returned to Ottawa, found the unfashionable framer, followed the instructions exactly, and told 6 of her closest friends, and all 6 eventually made the journey to Bellwood, because by then the word for Miss Colville among the women who had met her was not interesting or talented, or even remarkable. The word was true. She said true things, in the way that only people who have stopped being afraid of the reaction can say them. Now you have the whole of it. Come back with me to Ottawa, to Lord Stellan Vaux standing very still in the Governor-General's drawing room, with Sir Edmund Wharton's voice continuing pleasantly beside him, and follow him home. He left for the Gatineau Hills the next morning, having spent most of the night doing what he had spent the past year successfully avoiding, reading his own letter back to himself. Sentence by careful sentence, with the flattery stripped away. He had written well. He always wrote well. The sentences were gracious and considered, and they said, beneath the grace, exactly what they said. You are not sufficient. Go away and come back corrected. He had written that to the woman who had, in the 14 months since, become the most serious botanical illustrator working in Canada. He had written it to a mind that was doing what his own name and land and consequence had never managed to do, which was to be genuinely useful to people who needed it. He had parked a talent of the first order in his spare house and told it to work on its curtsy. He arrived at Bellwood, as the afternoon light was failing, and the house taught him something before he ever found her, because Bellwood was alive. He had left it a well-maintained empty estate. He walked into an establishment, the old library wing entirely reorganized into studio and workroom, specimen tables running along the north wall, 2 women he did not recognize sorting prints, Mrs. Firth at a tall desk reviewing correspondence with the calm authority of someone running a small publishing concern, which, he would gradually understand, was precisely what she was doing. And Brenna. She was at the central table, in a plain grey dress, comparing 2 illustrations under a lens, and she looked exactly as she had looked in her father's house in the Laurentians 18 months before, and entirely different. But because the difference had never been in her. It had been in the eyes doing the looking. He saw her now, the steadiness of her, the economy, the quality of stillness that was not passivity, but its opposite. A person so settled in themselves that the room around them could be busy or quiet, and it made no difference to the ground they occupied. He stood in his own doorway, seeing her truly for what felt like the first time, and the seeing was complete enough and late enough that he could not for a moment find a word. It was Mrs. Firth who noticed him. She stopped writing, and the room stilled with her, and Brenna looked up. I have thought about what she felt in that moment. I do not think it was triumph. She was past the need for it, which is the only condition in which genuine triumph arrives. I do not think it was anger, though the anger had been real and had lasted a winter, and had been, in its season, fuel of the cleanest kind. What I believe she felt, looking at the man in her doorway with his hat in his hands and his polished surface visibly cracked, was the thing she had felt reading his letter at her father's desk. That particular cold clarity of someone who sees a situation precisely and knows, without hurry, what she intends to do about it. She set down her lens. Lord Vaux, she said with the exact courtesy the situation required. You find us mid-project. Mrs. Firth, will you carry on? I believe his lordship and I should walk. They walked out through the kitchen garden in the last of the October light. And he did something then that surprised him. He spoke first, and he did not compose what he said before saying it. I have not come with an apology prepared, he said. I wrote 3 on the road from Ottawa, and they were all constructed, and I have had rather enough of my own construction lately. So I will say it plainly, and accept whatever poor impression plain language makes. He stopped walking. The letter I sent you was a cruelty, not the arrangement itself. That was simply an inheritance neither of us chose. But the letter. I told you that you were insufficient for my world, and I told you so in sentences I was proud of, and I told you because I had heard Lady Frederica Thorngate make a joke at your expense at a dinner table, and I had not said one word in answer to it. Not one. I sat there and I smiled, and I have thought about that smile almost every day for 14 months. I am not asking tonight for any part of the promise our fathers made. I have no standing to ask for it. I am asking only whether there is anything a man can do, beginning from nothing at all, to earn some small place in the life you have built here. Because I stood in that doorway and I saw it, and it is the first thing bearing my family's name that I have found genuinely admirable, and I had no hand in it whatsoever, and I feel the full weight of both halves of that sentence. Brenna walked in silence for a time. When she spoke, her voice was what it always was, level, deliberate, meaning everything it said. I am going to tell you what your letter gave me, she said, not because you deserve the comfort of it, but because the account should be complete and honest. The letter was a wound. I read it twice, and I understood it. And there were nights last winter, when what I felt about you I would not care to repeat in polite company. But Stellan, she said his name for the first time, without flourish, the way she named a plant accurately. You gave me the house, and the time, and the resources, and the instruction to improve myself, which you meant as a sentence of exile, and which I received as a commission. Every woman I know has been handed a version of what you sent me. Be less, be smaller, be readier. Most are handed it without a library and a northlit room, and 14 months of quiet. I was better insulted than anyone I have ever met, and I put the insult to work. That does not redeem the sending, but it means I cannot hate you with any consistency, and I have stopped attempting it, and that is more ground than you deserve to start from. She stopped walking and turned to face him. You asked what a man can do to deserve a place in this. I will tell you what he cannot do. He cannot arrive and fold this work into his title, Lord Vaux's industrious fiancée, the charming naturalist who illustrates wildflowers. Ottawa is already composing that story. I have read it in advance in 4 letters this month. If I marry you, that story swallows mine within a year, and every homesteader who buys a shilling guide will be buying a Viscountess's charity instead of a working naturalist's knowledge, and the thing will go on existing and stop being true. I will not trade true for grand. I made that exchange in reverse 14 months ago, and I know now exactly what it costs. She held his gaze without effort. So, if you wish to court me, these are the terms. Come back, and be of use and be nobody. Not Lord Vaux condescending to visit a workroom. A man in my doorway asking what needs doing, on the understanding that what needs doing is often dull and will have nothing to do with him. Do this for as long as it takes me to see whether the man I am speaking to now is someone you are capable of being every single day. I make you no promise of what follows. I am not a prize, and this is not a trial with a wedding at its end. It is only the truth. I could love the man I am looking at. I have thought so for some time. But I will not marry him until I have seen him hold himself up without the scaffolding, and I will not marry the other one under any arrangement our fathers made. He came back. That is the first thing to understand, and it is not a small thing. Men in his position, offered the long road instead of the quick absolution, mostly do not take it. He took rooms in the village 3 miles from Bellwood and presented himself at the workroom door the following morning. Brenna, without particular ceremony, put him to work on the printing correspondence, which had grown beyond Mrs. Firth's available hours, and Lord Stellan Vaux, 33 years old and impeccably educated for everything except usefulness, sat down at the far end of the worktable and became, for the winter and spring that followed, very thoroughly a clerk. He was, it emerged slowly and to no one's surprise more than his own, genuinely good at the unglamorous parts. The distribution problems, the printer contracts, the careful negotiation, with a Montreal bookseller who handled both French and English titles. These were things that an estate-educated man knew something about, and without the performance layered over the knowledge turned out to be sound. When a consortium of Ottawa stationers attempted to acquire exclusive rights to the Colville guides in order to raise the price above what homesteaders could pay, it was Vaux who found the maneuver buried in the contract language, and Vaux who dismantled it. Not with his rank, though it was available, but with 6 weeks of patient clerk's work and a revised agreement that Mrs. Firth's lawyer described, upon reading it, as thoroughly airtight. When Brenna reviewed the final agreement and came to the clause written in Vaux's own hand at the end of the document, stipulating that the pricing structure of the Homesteaders edition could not be altered by any future business arrangement, including, stated plainly in black ink, any arrangement arising from the personal circumstances of the designer. She sat with that page for a long while, alone. Mrs. Firth, passing the open door, saw her sitting with it and chose to say nothing, and smiled all the way down the corridor. He stayed through the winter and into the following summer, he learned the name of every woman in the workroom and the geography of every printing route in the Ottawa Valley. He grew quieter and plainer and more himself, and the single rainy afternoon that had mattered to her, that 1 hour in her father's house in the Laurentians, when he had forgotten to perform, stretched, week by week, into something that took up most of a working day. On an August evening, walking the same kitchen garden path they had walked in October, Brenna stopped and looked at him in the long, flat light, the distribution ledger under his arm, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled back, and said, in the voice that said few things and meant all of them, "The work has held. I have watched it all winter for where the seams would pull, and they have not. Ask me now if you are still asking, and ask without dressing it." Lord Stellan Vaux asked Miss Brenna Colville to marry him in the plainest words available to him, and stammered one of them, and she counted that in his favor and said yes. They were married in October, in the village church, and I will give you the 3 things worth remembering. The illustrations she chose for the church, framed along the side aisle, one for each season of the year they had spent building toward each other, were from the Homesteaders edition, the shilling guides, the prints that any settler family in the Ottawa Valley could afford to own. Mrs. Opal Firth kept the books. The Homesteaders edition remained at the same price it had always been, and continued so for the remainder of a long and thoroughly documented career, in which the Viscountess Vaux received correspondence from natural history societies in 6 countries, published 11 illustrated volumes, contributed to 3 government land surveys under her own name, and never once raised the price of the shilling guide. And Lady Frederica Thorngate. Since you are wondering, and you have been quite right to wonder, for I promised you at the beginning that I track my debts carefully, Lady Frederica arrived, the following spring, at the most significant wedding of the Ottawa season, wearing a brooch she had commissioned at considerable expense, and a 4-month wait from the only botanical artist whose work was considered appropriate for such an occasion. She was heard to admire it to 3 separate people before the first course was cleared. She never learned. For the Viscountess was serenity itself, and Mrs. Firth's commission records were private. That her order had been accepted by hand the very week it arrived. The illustration made personally by the naturalist's daughter from the Laurentians, who had taken the commission herself, and remarked to Mrs. Firth, clipping the final thread, that she had always intended to be very accommodating. If you ask me what this story is truly about, I will tell you it is about a man who could not tell a polished surface from a true one, and nearly lost everything worth having because of it. Polish is what frightened people put on things when they cannot afford to let anyone see what the thing actually is. It is expensive, and it wears, and underneath it the truth is always there unchanged, waiting with the patience of something that does not require an audience to exist. Grace is different in its nature entirely. Grace is what a thing becomes when it is wholly and honestly itself, and wastes nothing in the being. A field illustration made for a woman who needed to know what her child had eaten, a shilling guide left on a church lending library shelf, a woman in a north-lit room drawing what she sees because she has stopped asking anyone's permission to see it. Lord Vaux was raised to polish, and it made him elegant and hollow and quietly afraid. And he looked at Grace across a work table in the Laurentians and could not read it, and sent it away with a letter explaining that it needed improvement, that the Grace in question declined to require his recognition in order to flourish. That is the shape of this particular story. That it let him in at last, only after he had set the polish down and picked up a plain day's work with his own 2 hands. That, dear friends, is the justice of it. And I have always preferred my stories when the justice and the love arrive in the same carriage. Those are the ones that last. If you have been sitting with me long enough to feel the warmth of this fire tonight, and find you would like a permanent place beside it, the membership is just below. It costs very little, and it means considerably more than I will say directly. And if you have not yet subscribed to Moonlight at Bellwood, well, you know what I am going to tell you. You have owed me since the moment a man stood in his own doorway and understood, too late, and then just in time, that the stranger he was looking at was himself. Subscribe. Come back to me beneath the soft evening light, where every ending is deserved, and where the best work is always signed by its true author. Good night. And the next time you are certain that someone is plain, or provincial, or not quite ready for your particular world, do stop, won't you, and ask yourself whether the limitation is in the person or in the eye you are using to measure them. The finest field guides in Canada were compiled in a country house by a woman who had been sent there to learn to curtsy. They are still in print, and they are still a shilling.